Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Brittany. Great to be with you.
Of course, we have a wide-ranging conversation, so let's get right to it. I do want to start off with IVF. We saw controversial news come out of Alabama last month. The state Supreme Court ruled there that fertilized embryos are considered children. First, I want to get your thoughts here on that ruling.
Well, Brittany, I actually, at 29 years old, my husband and I found ourselves having real challenges being able to conceive. And so my twins, who are now 24-year-old young adults, Rebecca and Jake, are healthy and wonderful, and was the amazing beginning of our family. What is incredibly disturbing is that 12 years later, I was diagnosed with breast cancer and was also diagnosed with the BRCA2 genetic mutation, which made me and my descendants, if they have the mutation, dramatically more likely to get breast cancer and other forms of cancer. And what IVF allows you to do, when my children decide one day to have children, and if they carry the mutation, they can actually go through IVF and have embryos produced and tested to make sure that those that are implanted do not carry the genetic mutation, and we can end that cancer risk generationally in my family. And what this decision is, what this decision does from Alabama, as well as the Life Begins at Conception Act, which 125 Republicans in Congress have co-sponsored, would eliminate the ability for not only women and families to use IVF to start their families, but also prevent millions of people from ending the cycle of cancer in their family, or even preserving their own fertility before going through cancer treatment. And that's outrageous and unacceptable.
So I hear you. I hear that this is personal to you, and you're a co-sponsor of the Access to Family Building Act. Can you talk to us a little bit about that legislation?
What that would do is the Access to Family Building Act would codify in vitro fertilization and ensure that we do not make the completely bewildering and lacking in common sense determination in the law that that we're going to codify fetal personhood, or declare, as the Alabama decision did, that embryos are people, and preserve the ability of women like me, who were at the very young age of 29 years old, all the way up to women who are, beyond the, earlier childbearing years, who desperately want to have families and now have an opportunity to do so through the miracle of IVF, which, by the way, is incredibly expensive and should be covered by health insurance. But both the Alabama court decision, as well as the dangerous legislation that 125 Republicans are sponsoring, would put politicians and judges in the way of families being able to make their own choices about how to start families, and that's unacceptable.
Does your legislation have bipartisan support so far? What does that look like? Because when we heard that surprising, that controversial ruling out of Alabama, we did hear a lot of Republicans come out in support of IVF. So any Republican colleagues supporting this so far?
Well, there were a handful of Republicans who were co-sponsoring the Access to Family Building Act, and they actually turned tail and removed their names from it, unfortunately. Look, this is MAGA extremism, and unfortunately, Republicans are tied to the notion that it is a judge or a politician that should decide whether you can have a family, should make decisions about your reproductive process, and want to control women's bodies. And so we want to make sure that federal law across the board protects women's access to in vitro fertilization and allows women to start families. And those decisions should be made between their doctors and their doctors and patients, and their own God. And Republicans seem to think that it's the law that should be dictating when and whether families can get started.
Did those Republicans, if you could name them, did they have any reasoning aside to remove their names? What did they say to you?
They didn't speak to me directly about it. My understanding is that there were Republicans on this bill and they took their names off.
I am interested to talk about go ahead.
It's easy to check. They were previously on the bill, and you can, go on Congress.gov and take a look at who was previously a co-sponsor of the bill.
After this surprise ruling, the state's Senate and House both passed IVF protections. The bill was sponsored by a Republican state representative. Former President Donald Trump came out in support of IVF, as well as many Republicans. So with that being said, with the standard bearers of both parties supporting IVF, how much of a political threat is it under?
Well, you saw that all of these Republicans who supports the Life at Conception Act have gone racing to verbally say that they support in vitro fertilization, but talk is cheap. Action matters more, and you have a universal opinion across the Congress right now on the Republican side that support the notion that life begins at conception, supports legislation that says that, supports a national ban on a right to have an abortion, and who have repeatedly sponsored and supported legislation and blocked access. In the Senate, there was an effort to bring up a bill that was sponsored by Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, herself a mom who conceived through IVF, so that you could have a vote immediately to protect in vitro fertilization, and Republicans blocked it. So talk is cheap, and when push comes to shove during this election, it's going to be very clear that it's Democrats that have consistently supported a woman's right to make her own reproductive decisions, from birth to the need to terminate a pregnancy, particularly when her life or her health is jeopardized, or the baby's life is jeopardized, and down literally to Republicans being willing to control when and whether in vitro fertilization can be utilized.
Women's rights, as you know, are an important issue to Democrats. So what's your pitch to voters who feel disenfranchised over the past 2 years when they see this ruling out of Alabama, when they see Roe v. Wade overturned? How do you get them excited to vote for Democrats when they feel like over the past 2 years, their rights have been rolled back?
Well, the rights have been rolled back by Republicans, Brittany. I mean, it is only Republicans that have been standing in the way of a woman's right to make her own choices regarding abortion, standing in the way and trying to block women's ability to make reproductive decisions about when and whether they can have a child, blocking access to in vitro fertilization. Those are blocking access to birth control. I mean, we had an amendment vote in the appropriations process this year where Republicans voted to block access to contraception. I mean, so the proof is in the actions rather than the words. And so, for voters that care about standing and voting for candidates that believe that it is women and families that should be making decisions about their reproduction, it is consistently Democrats that have stood with them, and consistently Republicans that have voted to not only block their ability to make those choices, but increasingly made them more difficult.
According to a recent Harvard Caps Harris poll, abortion is the 5th most important issue facing Americans, and it's a long shot behind inflation, immigration, crime, and climate change. Do you think abortion is an issue that can galvanize voters in the 2024 election?
Well, I mean, the last 7 times since the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, where abortion rights have been on the ballot, it has passed 7 out of 7 times. So there is universal, overwhelming support for abortion rights across this country, and it crosses party lines. So the evidence that I have is when voters have had a chance to go to the polls and decide whether or not they are going to affirmatively place abortion rights in their constitutions or in their state laws, or block legislation or language that prevents them from being able to make those choices. Abortion rights has been adopted and embraced every single time. So while it might not be an issue that is the first choice of voters, if a voter is having a chance to vote on all things being equal, then it has consistently been demonstrated that a woman's right to make her own choices reproductively is the choice that the voter makes. By the
Congresswoman,
way, it's also, I think it's important to point out that during the presidential campaign, when voters compare and contrast Donald Trump and Joe Biden, I mean, Donald Trump brags about appointing a majority of the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade, and I think that's going to come back to haunt him as well.
Congresswoman, earlier in this conversation, you did share how IVF is personal to you. And I am curious, because it is personal to you, it has affected your life. What do you think then is missing from this national conversation? Because when IVF was jeopardized just a few weeks ago, this came to a shock to many Americans.
Yeah, I think this is not something that Americans realized would be in jeopardy when Roe versus Wade was overturned. It was a surprise to others, but not to most Democrats and not to pro-choice elected officials, because we warned that this was only the beginning. Even Brittany, even in the Dobbs decision, the concurrent opinion, the justices that signed on to the concurrent opinion specifically referenced IVF and the ability to limit it in their concurrent opinion. So this was telegraphed in the Dobbs decision, and now it's coming to fruition in Alabama. It's coming to fruition with major legislation that more than the majority of the Republican conference in the House has co-sponsored. Access to IVF is in jeopardy. And the other thing that I mentioned that people have not thought about when it comes to IVF is the ability to prevent future disease and the inability to prevent future disease when IVF is inaccessible, or when it is only able to be, for example, used to implant an embryo in a uterus, rather than being able to make sure that you can select out the disease that might end an eventual child's life. And that is not something that politicians and judges should be deciding.
Congresswoman, thank you for your remarks on those topics. I do not want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. Earlier this year, the ADL found that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States is up by about 360%. As a lawmaker, what are you doing to combat this?
Well, we've seen that spike rise dramatically even before October 7th, after the horrific attack that Hamas perpetrated against Israelis. And it has only gotten worse. What I'm doing, thankfully, we have a president in Joe Biden that has implemented the first national plan strategy to combat anti-Semitism, and it's a government-wide approach to ensuring that whether it's combating anti-Jewish bias and Jewish hate on college campuses, or engaging in civil rights protections to ensure that that when the law is violated, when Jews are having their rights infringed upon as a result of anti-Semitic attacks, that there can be intervention, making sure that there is a lot of investment in education and outreach. We have Jewish American Heritage Month each May, which was the first bill that I passed into law to ensure that, you know, the majority of Americans who really don't interact with Jews, or really in some cases have never met a Jewish person, are familiar with the idea that we are both a culture, a religion, and a rich heritage, not just a religion. And frankly, it's been essential that we make sure that we have task forces like the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism that I'm a co-founder of and a co-chair of, because there's been an explosion, Brittany, of online anti-Semitism. And what I've been doing and working with colleagues across the globe is to make sure that we pressure and eventually regulate the social media companies and the really lack of enforcement that they have in taking down hate and allowing it to spread virally with no accountability whatsoever. They need more aggressive policies, and we've been working diligently to make sure that that we pursue them on that.
Clearly, you've been one of the strongest opponents of anti-Semitism. You voted to censure a member of your own party, and you don't play politics at all when it comes to this issue. But do you think Democrats and the Biden administration in particular have done enough to call out anti-Semitism in the far left fringes or the far left progressives of your party?
I think the evidence again is in actions. Actions speak louder than words. It's important to speak out against hate, but it's very important to actually develop a multi-layered, all hands on deck approach like President Biden has with the national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. Having an agency by agency, government-wide approach to combating anti-Semitism specifically is critical, because it's really the best way to ensure that not only can we embed practices and policies within government agencies to combat hate, but we can also have those agencies establishing policies to ensure that Jews or people who are believed to be Jews for a variety of reasons are able to seek protection, and that we can stop that hate in its tracks, which really, whether it's, projections of anti-Semitic messaging on the sides of buildings on college campuses, or banners being thrown over the side of highways. Or intimidation tactics being used on college campuses, and attacks happening in communities. There's a line that, when crossed, really delineates the difference between your First Amendment rights to express yourself and the lack of a right to endanger somebody. And that's where law enforcement has to get involved. And it's also where the national strategy is assisting in making sure that we can protect people from the kind of hate that's been spreading so virally.
But specifically, do you think that the Democratic Party has been vocal enough as a whole to call out the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses, the anti-Semitic remarks within your own party? Do you think that your party has been vocal enough in that?
I have colleagues across our caucus who have called out the hate on the right and the left. Most of the anti-Semitism, quite frankly, takes place in conservative corners with white supremacists that are systematically engaged in attacking Jews, in demonstrating and engaging in anti-Semitic tropes where it has existed on the left. And frankly, it's increased on the left as well, particularly as it relates to anti-Zionism, which is a form of anti-Semitism. We had a resolution that we passed on the floor that was passed unanimously that called out that kind of hate in the aftermath of some of the hate that came from the left, the anti-Semitic actions that came from the left. We did censure a colleague, Congresswoman Tlaib, and that garnered support from some Democrats as well. And the White House has certainly, including the president, has called out hate on both the right and the left. So that's important to use our platforms in order to make sure that we're allowing hate to be tolerated in any court.
According to polls, support for Israel on the progressive left has dropped. What do you make of this? Do you see this as a generational change? Does this worry you? What does that look like?
Well, I'm not really sure what you mean by the progressive left. That's fairly undefined and amorphous. A recent Harvard-Harris poll showed that there is continued overwhelming support. 82% of Americans support Israel's right to defend itself against the horrific terrorist attack that was perpetrated against her on October 7th. Oppose Hamas. Hamas was at 18%. I'm surprised it got that much, but there are haters, everywhere. And so I look more broadly at whether or not the U.S.-Israel relationship is continuing to have support, which it does. There is a clear line of delineation against terrorism and in support of a sovereign nation like Israel being able to protect its citizens, ensure that it doesn't have terrorists living on its border, bring the hostages home. And so the polling that I have seen has really been heartening, because there's so much coverage now that really exclusively focuses on the plight of Palestinians, which we need to make sure get humanitarian aid. But to point to the left, which there are certainly people who are on the extreme left that are definitely anti-Israel, who were anti-Israel before October 7th, and we need to just make sure that we lean on the idea and the evidence that shows that the overwhelming majority of Americans stand with Israel in and her right to defend herself.
You just touched on the US-Israel relationship. Over the weekend, I'm sure you saw that Vice President Kamala Harris did call for a ceasefire. She also called for the release of hostages, as well as aid to Gaza. Do you think that there could be any sort of ceasefire without the release of hostages?
Well, let's be very clear about what the vice president said, because I watched what she said. She called for a ceasefire of at least 6 weeks. That's a temporary ceasefire. She specifically called for the hostages to be released, for Hamas to accept the deal that Israel has agreed to, that is on the table right now. So let's just be clear and accurate about what it is that she said. And her message was consistent with what President Biden has been saying, which is that we need to make sure that there is a temporary pause in fighting for a period of time to allow the hostages to be released, and for humanitarian assistance to get in, to be able to provide assistance and food and kind of assistance that innocent civilians need in Gaza. And the administration continues to not be dictating to Israel about whether or not they would continue fighting after that, as they shouldn't, because no country should be expected to live with a terrorist organization on their border, sworn to their destruction, as Hamas continues to be.
So you are in support of her comments for that temporary ceasefire in exchange for some, if not all, of those hostages to be released?
I am supportive, and I signed a letter just last week led by my colleague Brad Schneider, for a mutual temporary pause in fighting, so that in exchange for hostages being released, all of the hostages being released, including the 6 American hostages, and for humanitarian assistance to get in. But that is different than an immediate ceasefire with none of those conditions being a part of it. I am not for that, and neither is the administration.
So just to be clear, you are not for that. I know that the administration is not. However, I have talked to some Democrats who are. That is not your position.
Oh, I'm definitely not for an immediate ceasefire without conditions like bringing the hostages home. I'm for a temporary pause in fighting that is mutually agreed to, that Hamas releases the hostages, that the aid is allowed in, and to provide assistance to the people suffering in Gaza, innocent civilians suffering in Gaza, and that Israel has the right to defend herself and eradicate the threat that Hamas represents.
Congresswoman, I really appreciate the wide-ranging conversation. You're welcome back anytime. Thank you again so much for joining me.
Thank you, Brittany. Thanks so much for having me.